Hey everyone, this is Dan Blank from We Grow Media. Today on the podcast, I talk to author Allison Leotta. We dig into her incredible career, and really what we're talking about here is a career transition. She spent more than a decade as a crimes prosecutor, and she made the transition to being a full-time author. She has 5 books out, one in the pipeline, as she says, and the 7th one she is writing now. And we really dig into how she made that transition, how she got her agent, what she's learned about the writing process, and really everything that comes before and during and after that. I love this conversation, and I felt like we dug so deeply into what does it mean to do meaningful work as an author, and how that extends to other expertises that you may have. This was an incredible chat for me, and I'm really thrilled to be able to share it with you. Hey everyone, this is Dan Blank from We Grow Media. Today I'm thrilled to be speaking with author Allison Leotta. Welcome.
Hi, Dan. Great to see you.
I appreciate that. We've known each other for quite a while now.
You used to be my professor.
That's a nice way to put it. So you have made, many authors were sort of one thing professionally and then they became an author. You have had this really intense shift from one career to another. And what I love about it is the deep connection to it, which we'll talk about. But can you tell me a bit about the work that you did before you became an author?
Sure. That's what I write about now. So I was a prosecutor in DC. I specialized mostly in sex crimes, domestic violence, and crimes against children. And it was, as you and I have discussed, it was intense. It was just incredibly intense job. I talk to a lot of people about their jobs, and they change and switch it up. And you're not really defined by your job. Sometimes it's something you do. It's not who you are. But I'm not sure sex crimes prosecutor falls under that category. I think being a sex crimes prosecutor, I haven't done it in many years. It's still with me. I think it will always be with me. It kind of changed who I was as a mom and who I was as a woman, as a lover. All those things are super impacted by what I saw on a daily basis. And so I think that's actually why I started writing about it. It was such a very intense experience, and it was cheaper than therapy to sit down at the computer.
I didn't want to jump into the books this quickly, but right off the bat, that's intriguing, this idea of, was writing about it a way of processing it and almost going through, writing your story where you're able to kind of work through it by writing it down?
I think so, yeah. And also to have a means of kind of controlling it. Like in real life, the narratives are so tangled and twisted, and there are very few kind of neat endings that you can tie up with a little bow in the way that you necessarily have to in a novel. And there's this nice sense of making it turn out the way you want, or at least being able to definitively solve every mystery that is presented, and to take some control over it. So I definitely had this feeling. I'd never written before, other than legal briefs, which sometimes can be stranger than fiction. Sometimes you'd be writing the facts section of a legal brief in the sex crimes unit, and it was just so crazy it would sound like a fictional book. But I hadn't written actual fiction before. Legal writing is very prescribed. It's very much facts, and not just facts, but facts that you know you can prove under the rules of evidence in a court of law. So there's no wiggle room. There's no in terms of the factual stuff. But as I was in this job, I had this feeling that I just had to sit down and start writing creatively, and I'd never had that feeling before. It was this almost physical need to sit down and start doing it, and so that's when I did. I was kind of playing with it at first, and then kept saying, I kept coming home from court saying, someone needs to put this in a book. Someone needs to put this in a book. And my husband, who is also a federal prosecutor, although he did public corruption.
Your dinner conversations must have been fascinating, or must be fascinating.
I hope somebody would think they're fascinating. I think our kids think they're super boring and they'd much rather talk about Pokemon Go. But yeah, he kind of got it. Kind of got it because doing political corruption is a very different thing than doing sex crimes. But he kept saying, do it. Like, do it now. Put your money where your mouth is. No one's going to do it except you. So, you can't control anyone else. Do it. And so I kept saying, yeah, good idea. I'll totally do it one of these days. And then I became pregnant with my first child. And I think anyone who was a first-time mom knows the feeling of like, whoa, my life is about to change big time. And I was like, it's now or never. So I had all this, what the government calls use or lose leave. I just never had taken much vacation. I had to use it or lose it. So I used it. I went up to a little cottage in upstate New York, and I had a week, and I was going to write my novel in that week. Right?
I hate to have to ask this. How'd that work out?
I'm pretty sure you can guess how that worked out. 2 years later, I had a novel.
I love it.
But it got some momentum going. I'm not sure a single word that I typed during that week actually ended up in the published novel, but it did get. I think momentum is an important thing, and
I want to back up a little bit here because I think I don't want to gloss over things that are so important. Like, I'm trying to think of any career that would be as harrowing and how, just the toll it takes on you as the work that you were doing. How did you choose that? What was your path? Because I almost thought you were going to say, oh, when I was a teenager, I was writing, and then I got into law because of whatever, and then I got to go back. But how did you get on the path, the legal path, the prosecutor path?
Right. Well, I don't know if you know this, Dan. My dad was a federal prosecutor, too. He was a federal prosecutor in Detroit, and he had a lot of fascinating stories. I've always liked a good story, and I think there are a few jobs that compete with the amount of fascinating stories you can bring home as a prosecutor. I mean, you just see everything. So he would come home with these great stories, and he just had this satisfaction with his job that you see with very few other legal professionals. Like this idea that every day he's waking up, he's using his time and his talent to try to do something great with the world, to try to make the world a slightly better place. And that was infectious. Otherwise I think I would have become a veterinarian. I think in some parallel universe, I'm driving a red pickup truck. I've got my little mutt curled up in the seat next to me. I'm making house calls, but I wasn't that good at biology. And pretty good at the writing stuff. So I did the liberal arts stuff. I applied to law school. I got into Harvard Law School, and at that point, it was just a no-brainer. They let you in, you go. So
yeah.
And I've always wanted just the most interesting job I could get. And so when I graduated from law school, I went to the prosecutor's office, and I worked doing prosecution for 12 years.
What is the timeline? So, because I don't know exactly when you say I want to become a lawyer, a prosecutor, how many years is that?
Well, after college, college 4, and then law school's 3 years. And then I clerked for an amazing judge in Ohio called Algernon Marbley. He's an amazing guy.
That is the greatest name for anyone I've ever heard.
I know, right? I need to use that.
Wow. I love it.
I'll have to make a good character. I haven't used that name yet. And I really wanted to work at the Justice Department. You really can't work at the Justice Department right out of law school or right out of a clerkship. It's very difficult. They usually require several years of experience. There's one way to get in is through this program called the Honors Program. And Judge Marbley was a fierce advocate for me, making a lot of calls to all the interviewers saying, you got to hire this woman. And that's for any law students out there considering a clerkship, do it. Like, you'll never have a stronger relationship with your boss or get more of an insight into how the legal process goes on, or to have like this kind of advocate who's kind of like a second mom or dad to you and will be on your side forever. So I really have to thank the judge for the fact that I got into the Justice Department. And I got in. I was doing consumer litigation, so I was prosecuting all sorts of consumer fraud, which was interesting. But it was this very it was a national practice. So I'd be going to New York.
Is consumer fraud like someone like ripping off the McDonald's Monopoly game thing? Like, what is consumer fraud?
Oh my gosh, my kids are totally are responsible for that. I hope we don't get prosecuted. It's fraud on the consumers.
Oh, okay. Flip it around. Okay.
Yeah. So it's like people who are odometer tampering, or I kind of developed a specialty in these. There were all these drug supplements out there, and they're like crazy claims. So there was like a guy selling apricot seeds as a cancer cure, which is super dangerous because people were taking the apricot seeds instead of getting actual cancer medicine, stuff like that. There was a guy selling like a cow hormone as a diet aid, which I think it actually did start to help people lose weight a little bit until they had a heart attack and died, those sorts of things. And it was really interesting. It was fascinating stuff. They were big, slow cases. And I was always coming in as this guy from DC who nobody knew. And I'd have to like really prove myself in each jurisdiction. Because here I am, I'm like this 26-year-old woman coming in from Washington, DC. And, there'd be this gray-haired old man judge and a gray-haired old guy, defense attorney. And they'd be looking at me like, who are you to come in here and tell, and represent the United States? So it was, there was definitely a sense of being underestimated and wanting to do even better because of that, and kind of sometimes using being underestimated to my advantage. So, people.
My entire education of what law school is like is the movie The Paper Chase.
Yes.
Which is one of my favorite movies.
Oh, that's awesome that you've seen it. It's kind of obscure.
I have seen that movie so many times. I don't know why. I just love that movie. John Houseman.
I love that movie too.
So even as we get here, so you're in high school and you have this father and you kind of see how important this work is. It aligns to you for some reason. This is going to be the kind of work you want to do. You go through college, you get into law school. My whole impression of following the law path is 80, 90-hour weeks, incredible pressure, incredibly competitive, difficult work, in the same regard as like high-end mathematics would be difficult. What was that process like? Because to just say, I did 4 years in college and 3 in law school and a clerkship, like, I feel like there's a rigor there that we're not digging into.
Yeah, I mean, definitely, but that's the boring part, Dan. Like, let me tell you all the hours that I studied. I studied a lot. Those are the parts of the book where, like, I would sum it up in like 2 sentences. You pulled many all-nighters. Yeah, I mean, I went to Michigan State University. It's a big party school. And I definitely did my share of that, but I also did a big share of just sitting down and studying and mastering these things. And I think that's the thing that everyone who achieves anything at all has in common, and which is kind of glossed over sometimes, is that it all comes down to hard work.
Yeah.
It's not like someone just waves a fairy wand and you have a great novel. Like you know this, right? Like, I think there's this impression that you're hit by inspiration, you sit down, your fingers fly over the keyboard, and voila, you've created this beautiful piece of art.
And it doesn't need any editing.
Right? No, it's not. And it's all just about the inspiration, right? But it just comes down to, for me at least, maybe not for Stephen King, but for me at least, it comes down to just digging in and getting down into the weeds and focusing on how I can make this better, and really just committing yourself to doing it right.
For the legal part, for all of the college and the clerkship, I mean, the way you talked about your father and how you saw the importance of this work, how much did that affect you wanting to go into it and staying in that? Because I find that with almost any career, I think a lot of people are missing that. They don't have that, they assume it. But was that a big factor for you, or was it something separate that drew you to that?
I think it was a big factor for sure. I mean, I ended up in the exact same job my dad had, so we're both AUSA.
There's such thing as coincidence.
Yeah. So no, I think it was a pretty big factor, and I think I also I compared it to what I saw other lawyers doing. You go to law school, you have your summer clerkships, you make a lot of money at these firms, and they do end up throwing a lot of money at you when you graduate. You can instantly become very, very comfortable once you graduate from a law school like Harvard. But I saw how many lawyers were so unhappy with their jobs, with their practices, and just kind of trudging through and doing the motions because they kind of had to. And my dad didn't feel that way. He really loved what he was doing, and to me, it's that's what you spend the majority of your waking hours on. So you should like it. You should like what you're doing. You should feel good about what you're doing. So if you can, if it's at all possible, for some people it's not possible. Like some people just, feel lucky to come to a country and clean bathrooms. And I feel like I was so fortunate to be able to even have that choice, the choice of like choosing a profession that because it was interesting and I felt proud of it is a real luxury.
So you're doing consumer fraud. How does it transition from there?
Right. So there were great cases, but there were huge cases. They'd go to trial like you'd have a couple trials a year, and you'd be in different cities, and you'd finally make a name for yourself. You'd be like, okay, now in Arizona, I'm totally respected, and then you'd be off to Seattle, and you'd have to prove yourself in Seattle again. But it was. I really wanted to dig in and be doing things in my community, in where I lived in Washington D.C. And I didn't want to be going to trial once a year. I wanted to be in court all the time, and I wanted to do the things that were affecting people in my community. So I applied to the U.S. Attorney's Office, and luckily got in there, the U.S. Attorney's Office in D.C. So there are two paths in the U.S. Attorney's Office. You can do street crimes, drug crimes, and then you kind of work your way up to homicide, the most serious of the violent crimes. Or you can do like kind of special victims path, which starts with like the misdemeanor domestic assaults. It goes up to felony assaults, and then ends with the first degree sex assaults, the most serious of crimes.
So you choose to go what I can only imagine is the toughest route, the toughest path. You're going towards these crimes that are going to be. I mean, I can't even imagine. So you're making that decision. So you're saying, I enjoy this career. This is important. At the same time, you're choosing, I'm going to do work that is as important as I can make it. But you also have to know that your daily life is going to be filled with the worst of the worst. Is that part of the equation?
Yeah, I think you know that on a intellectual level, and then you start doing it, and it's a different experience than what you can imagine. Just to kind of have that on your desk and in your face and in your life constantly, and to kind of feel that responsibility. I always felt like I just had to do everything I could to get it right, because I was the only thing kind of standing in between any sort of measure of justice happening or the person going free and doing it again to another kid, another woman. And so it was, I never left the job. I have fantasies about being a barista. Like you make the coffee and that's it. You go home and you don't think about the coffee. You don't work on the coffee at home. But I was working insane hours, those 80, 90 hours that you're talking about, that's what I was working. And even when I was home, I was working. I would be talking to my husband about it, and he'd be giving me suggestions about what I could do, legal issues. So it was a nonstop, intense sort of thing. And the things that you see are so painful and upsetting that it really does kind of change your view of the world a little bit. At the same time, there were some real heroes, some incredible, inspiring people and family members, victims who were so courageous, and seeing how they're able to heal was also really inspiring. So it's really the whole kind of yin yang, the darkness and the light, and it's all kind of there every day.
So, and I don't know, I mean, so if you're a prosecutor, you're in the courtroom, you are presenting to the judge, to the jury. Is that correct?
Yes.
I have to imagine that a huge part of what you're doing is storytelling. you are getting all the elements of the story, you are researching, you're doing all this, figuring out what's not there. Then you have to get what you can with that, figure out what's missing, do that. But then you've got to present it, and you're presenting it, I have to imagine, in a written form, in an oral form, in a context where you're actually debating with people. Do you feel that is kind of gave you like an MFA in this idea of how to write, of how to craft a story, of what's compelling to people, of what isn't enough, of where is like a hole, that sort of thing?
Right. No, they're very different types of writing.
Really?
Yeah, I mean, I can put a sentence together. I know where to put a comma, but that legal writing is so different. It really is. I mean, you don't, and the legal speaking, it's definitely storytelling.
Yeah.
For sure, it's storytelling, but it's using a totally different part of the brain. You are finding out what actually happened and then writing down what actually happened, which is a completely different exercise than making up a story. It's the opposite exercise. Making up a story is in many ways harder because there is nothing to guide you. I've actually thought about writing some nonfiction because it might be easier to just research and figure out what happened and then write that, as opposed to having to come up with all the elements yourself. So it did give me a lot of material, though. There is just so much craziness happening on a daily basis, and it's so surprising. I've seen so many crazy things, and I never lost my ability to just be completely surprised and blown away. I would think, you'd get jaded or cynical, but every day you're like, whoa, I didn't know that could happen. That was crazy. And I feel like that kind of lends itself to the thriller because, you're looking, the next page, there's something you never expected. And so, yeah.
And is this during the time, I got rid of my television a long time ago, so I'm really ignorant here, but there have been a rash of very popular shows that are on this kind of topic, right?
Yeah.
And this is one thing you do, is you sort of have covered these too, haven't you, sort of on the blog and everything?
Yes, I did. I don't do it anymore, but I was blogging about Law and Order SVU and what I got right and wrong from the legal and reality perspective.
Is there an easy way for you to encapsulate that? Because I think it's fascinating, this idea of you being just in it versus this kind of popular culture, telling stories and raising issues, but it's on a television. It's different.
Yeah, no. I mean, there were just absolutely ridiculous plot lines and just some crazy stuff all the time. But I have to say, I do think that shows like SVU, CSI, all the alphabet soup shows, they are doing a real service in some ways, and like the broader perspective. Like it's fun for me to laugh at or throw popcorn at something when they get some technical point wrong, or they have some plot that's completely implausible, or they can tell where the mushrooms in the victim's stomach, they can tell they were grown in some Argentinian eco-organic farm, and therefore they know like where the killer came from. It's just silly. It's just silliness. But what they've done, I think, on a broader level, which I think is super important as a prosecutor, is they've created a conversation, and they have taught a vocabulary to a generation that didn't have it before. And so much of these crimes, domestic violence, sex offense crimes, they are able to happen. They flourish in the dark. They flourish in people not being able to talk about them, the shame that surrounds them, the idea that you're all alone, that no one has ever gone through this before, and this is the shameful thing you must keep to yourself because you'd be totally different from everyone else if you ever talked about it, is something that I think was such a pervasive factor one generation ago. People didn't talk about it at all. There's like this whole generation of kids molested by priests who never brought it up because like it was just so incredibly shameful. And what the SVUs of the world are doing is giving us a way to talk about it, to show that it happens. It's not your fault. Here is this beautiful young actress, and it happened to her, and it makes it more relatable. And I look at things like, the Bill Cosby case. Mm. And, this is like the 1970s. He's like slipping drugs into these young actresses' drinks, and he's sexually assaulting them. And they come out of it, they wake up, and they're like, whoa, like what just happened to me? This, there is no word for that. It wasn't a rape in the way that we understood rapes at the time. A rape was some stranger hiding in the bushes who jumps out and drags you into the forest. This wasn't a rape. This is like America's favorite dad and my mentor. And, that's now we have the term date rape, and just having that term gives you a way to talk about it in a way that they didn't. And what you saw a lot of those survivors saying at the time was like, I didn't know what it was that had happened. I knew it was wrong, but I didn't know what it was. And I think just the fact that we can talk about this now in a way that we couldn't a generation ago has made a huge difference. It's still the most underreported of crimes. Sex crimes are vastly, vastly underreported. If it made it to my desk in the prosecutor's office, it was an anomaly. But I think that is changing. I think that's a huge and wonderful thing that's happening in our time.
So you're working these 80, 90-hour weeks on these cases that are, I'll just broadly call them horrific. And in that process, you're saying, I want to start writing. There's ideas you have, there's things you want to work out, there's whatever. So is that week in the cabin the first time you started doing that, or were you jotting things down or thinking for years before that?
I had not been jotting things down. And now I really wish I had been jotting things down. I wish I'd been taking notes,
Yeah.
The cabin was really the first time.
But you said it out loud, though. You just had a conversation to your husband where you're like, I don't know, I want to write a story.
I said it many times before I actually did it.
I have to ask, was it for years and years, or was it just over a period of time?
I think it was probably over a couple of years.
I love that you had someone close to you who said, do it, which is amazing. And I say that just because a lot of people don't have that. They have people who say the opposite. How on earth did the cabin in the woods come into this? Because this feels like such a stark thing. Like I'm imagining the origins of Batman, and he has to go up to the mountain to receive training. And like, where did this idea come that you're going to go by yourself and write for a week? Because that's such a stark thing.
Yeah, no, it wasn't actually that stark. That sounds more dramatic. I wish it was kind of that dramatic, but it wasn't that. So my husband Mike's family, they used to run a summer camp like in the 1920s up in New York. Aww. And now it's just a bunch of like kind of very, very rustic. Rustic is the like cute term for it. Yes. Cottages up on this big plot of woods. So I went up with Mike, and he actually wrote a screenplay. We decided he was going to do it too. So he wrote a screenplay. I wrote the beginning of the novel. He wrote much faster than I did. And, but his screenplay is just sitting in a drawer somewhere as a screenplay about Santa Claus. It's really cute.
I just love that sentence. My jaw's like on the floor. This idea of he wrote much faster than I did, but his screenplay is sitting in a drawer.
Yeah.
What a neat thing that you both went up to create something new, though.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Have you done? I mean, it's like but like that just sounds such a neat thing to decide to do together. I just think that's incredible.
Hey. Yeah.
So you started working on it, and then you got serious. So you did it for that week, and like you said, it just created momentum. How did that create momentum? Because writing is hard.
Yes, it's hard. I think writing the novel was the hardest thing I've ever done in terms of self-discipline. Wow. And I went to law school, and I've climbed mountains, I've run marathons, but the discipline that it took to keep going for 2 years, I think is the biggest accomplishment, because there's such a temptation to just sleep in.
But I don't get the impression that you were just sleeping in. I get the impression you're running marathons and working this incredibly important and difficult job.
But I I think it worked because I liked it. If I hadn't
Yeah.
liked doing it, it'd be a different story. But it was my outlet. So before that, uh, I would come home at night and watch some TV, and that was a really good way to relax and if I had time, I would watch a little TV, and then if I had time in the morning, I would work out. So those are my outlets, and I cut those both out. So I
Wow.
stopped exercising for 2 years, and I stopped watching TV. So I really admire that you have gotten rid of the TV in your house, because I think I still have a TV, and I'm sure I'd be a much more productive person if I got rid of that damn thing. But it was turning off the TV for a year, and I would go to bed early. I'd go to bed at like 9. I'd wake up at 5. I would write for 2 hours in the morning before then getting dressed and going to work. And that's how I got it done. It was kind of slow and steady. I was still at the prosecutor's office. I was still at the U.S. Attorney's office, and so it was just those 2 hours in the morning.
And did you feel you had a guide? Was there a methodology, a book, or anything? Or was it just, no, I was just writing the story I wanted to write based on your preference?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a huge reader. I've always been like, that's the thing that's defined me as a kid, as a grown up. Grown up, yeah. Uh, just reading. Just I'm a member of 3 different book clubs. I read a lot, and so you get a sense of how a story's supposed to move. But
Totally.
it's a totally different thing to write it than to read it, right? To figure out how to do it. So I wrote my first draft in a year, and then it took another year to really make it work. They say all writing is rewriting, right? So it was.
Yes. So at what point did you decide to try to get it published, and what was that path for you?
It was around year 2, the second year. And I got the book, How to Get Your Book Published for Dummies, and which I now wish was a different book, because I suggested to people, and I'm like, and not that I think you're a dummy, but this is the book I. Um, Basically, it was like, just get an agent, and you're going to have 1,000 rejections, so be prepared. So I was prepared. I've approached all this like a lawyer. I outlined my novels. When I was going to get an agent, I did a nice Excel spreadsheet of all the agents I wanted in the order that I was hoping to approach them, and the rejections I'd get, and room for notes. And I actually there was this amazing agent named Elaine Coster, who had just gotten this fabulous deal for a woman who graduated from my law school a few years after I did, Julie Bucksbaum. And so I reached out to Julie, who I didn't know. I didn't have anyone in common with her, but she was so kind, so generous. Responded. We talked on the phone. And this is actually something that has amazed me about the writing community, is how generous everybody is. They're big names, small names, everybody's just kind of in it together, and has been overwhelmingly kind and welcoming. And that's something I just love about the community. And Julie Bucksbaum introduced me to that. And so she was, I could tell she was at first being very protective of her agent. Like, you get a lot of these calls from aspiring writers. I'm sure you do too, Dan. And you can't pass on everybody to your agent. I could tell she's trying to protect her. But then eventually she's like, well, you know what? Given all this, I think she would be interested in maybe hearing from you. Hang on, I'll call her. So she called her, and she called me back in like 7 minutes and said, yeah, she's really interested in hearing from you. So here's the connection. So she made the connection. I ended up talking to Elaine's assistant, sent in my full manuscript, and within a week she offered to represent me. So
Wow.
it was amazing. It felt like winning the lottery.
Yeah, I'm trying to imagine that idea, that idea of taking it to the next level and having that connection happen, where there's now someone who's like on your team and representing you. What was the process like from there of finding a publisher and getting it out there and all of that?
I still remember when Elaine called I was sitting in my office at the U.S. Attorney's office. I still have the blue shirt I was wearing at the time. I started like sweating. I was just sweating profusely. Oh my God, she wants to represent me. And like, it was this moment in my life. It was like this ginormous moment, and I don't know, that was amazing. After that, it became very technical within the Justice Department because I had to have the whole thing vetted to make sure I wasn't violating any ethics rules or revealing any state secrets. So everything kind of had to pause, and I had to have everybody read it. The U.S. attorney read it. Different people in the ethics department, people high up at Main Justice had to read it. And
what an interesting set of beta readers.
Yes, right? And when you think about everything that like needs to happen at the Justice Department,
they're telling you like plot points you missed and stuff.
I knew there were like I have sex scenes in it, and I would see like my boss on the elevator, and I'd be like, "Hey, Channing, how you doing?" And it's kind of funny because as a sex crimes prosecutor, you're writing sex stuff all the time. You're constantly writing the word vagina in your brief, so you need to be like pretty cool with that sort of thing, talking about that sort of thing with your boss. But it was a different experience when I'd written a nice sex scene, which kind of makes no sense, right?
That's fascinating too. And also because you're choosing to, like, this is part of your art and your craft.
Right. Yeah. So they eventually just passed it through. They asked for a few minor changes. They were really quite minor. I was very lucky that way, and sent it along with their blessing, which was great. And then Elaine sold it. She sold it to Simon & Schuster.
That's awesome. Just like that moment too.
It was amazing. And then Simon Schuster, the next kind of amazing moment was that Simon Schuster said, "Oh, we'd really like you to keep writing this as a series," which was not something I had ever anticipated. God, when I look back on it, I had no idea what I was doing. I had no idea that this was like kind of the bread and butter of the mystery and thriller marketplace, these series where, you have the character that continues going on and on. And I was just kind of lucky that I'd written this character that had the ability to go on into other books.
And when you were doing that first book, taking it seriously, getting an agent, did you have other books in your head, or were you not even going there yet?
Oh yeah, yes, I had all sorts of books in my head. They had nothing to do with being a prosecutor. I have a whole female pirate series in my head.
That's awesome.
And it's been there for like 10 years. I hope I actually get around to writing it one of these days. I did not know that I was getting myself into writing a series about sex crimes. But
and you're on book 5 now, or 5 are out?
5 are out. 6 is in the pipeline, and I'm working on 7.
Wow. So when did you make the career shift in that process?
Let's see. Dan, it all becomes kind of a blur to me because
this is not that long ago.
Yes, but in the middle of it, you have to appreciate that I gave birth to 2 children, like 2 years apart. So, the whole they call it the baby brain that comes out was going on as I'm like. I remember one call I had with somebody in the literary world, and I was actually hooked up to a breast pump, pumping milk while I was taking this call.
Yeah,
and
totally.
It just all kind of, maybe it was just this creative moment in my life where I was creating my books, I was creating these kids, but it was insane, and it all in some ways is a big blur of feedings and midnight wakings and getting out stories and doing your class, trying to crack the code on marketing, trying to follow all the steps that you gave us. So it was, as it's an intense time, and then throw a couple days in there.
How was it leaving the career? I mean, in that way of making, so even if we don't have the timeline or all of that, but leaving that behind is interesting. I always think about this idea of, I have this phrase I use a lot, the creative shift, where you're going from one thing to another. And even though you're often going to something that feels truer, feels important, feels like a good evolution, it's terrifying because you don't quite know what that is fully. And you very firmly know the thing you're leaving, the thing that feels safe, the thing where you get validation, where the work is important, you seem to be well compensated. Do you miss that work in a way? Is that something, where is it just, no, things go where they go?
No, I definitely miss it, and it was very hard decision. It was really what defined me, and still in many ways defined me. I think it will always kind of define me a little bit that I was a prosecutor, that did sex crimes. Um, so it was a really hard decision, but I was at this point where I was trying to do three what I felt were all super important things at once: being a good mom, being a good prosecutor, being a good writer. And there was this one moment that I remember where I realized I was trying to do all three, and I was like, I can't do this. I was on my day off. I had a day off of work, and I decided to use that day to try to go visit a building in DC where I was going to set a scene. But I had my kids with me in the double stroller. So I'm pushing the double stroller down Pennsylvania Avenue, going to the city council building. And my phone rings, and it's Detective Wanda Fields. And this is kind of gross, Dan, but there's this like fetal tissue, because there was this girl who had been raped, and she had an abortion. And we needed the fetal tissue in order to test it to establish paternity of the rapist. So, but like there were problems with the laboratory turning over the fetal tissue, and like she'd had to go, like we had to talk about her. She had to like go to 7-Eleven and like get a cooler and some ice. Like it was crazy. It was crazy. And I'm like, I'm talking to the detective. I'm pushing the double, like one hand I'm talking to the detective, the other hand I'm pushing the double stroller, and I'm trying to get to the tour at the building at the right time. And I was like, what is this? I can't do all three of these. I can't. And my kids are crying, mommy, and I'm trying to get out some goldfish crackers. So it was like, that was kind of the moment. It kind of encapsulated just kind of a whole lifestyle that I had, which was like trying to juggle all three constantly at the same time. And it was kind of at that moment where I realized, whoa, like some choices need to be made here. If you want to be good at any of these, you can't do all three of them at the same time. And at that point, Simon & Schuster had me under contract for 2 more books, and it was thrilling. It was, being a lifelong bookworm, it was the most thrilling thing to be invited to be part of this world, to be a contributor to it, not just a consumer of it. And I just had, that was a no-brainer. I had to do that. And I wasn't giving back the kids. So so that it was pretty clear what I had to do.
Yeah.
It kind of broke my heart a little bit. And I'm still, my best friends, the people who are like my core, are still the ladies from the U.S. Attorney's Office. So
do you find, and we alluded to a little bit with like the TV stuff, but because of what you're writing about, and especially because people know your background, do you have readers coming to you talking about this, talking about, do you feel you're opening the door in that way too, which I have to imagine you're getting that as well, because this is sort of your life's work in many ways.
Right. Yes, for sure. And I think that was the thing that surprised me the most when I started as a prosecutor, and also continuing now today, is how much this sort of crime has affected so many people. I thought, and I think this is how kind of the job changes you too, is now I just see it as being everywhere. Whereas before I thought it was just this tiny anomaly little thing. But, we would do, as a prosecutor, when you're selecting a jury, you ask the jurors, who here has ever been accused of or a victim of a sex crime? And a quarter or a third of the people would raise their hand. And one by one, you bring them up and they tell their story. And those are just the ones who are raising their hands. I'm sure there are also people who didn't raise their hands, right? And those aren't the ones that necessarily were adjudicated through the police or the prosecutor's office or anything. They're just telling you that because they're feeling it's their civic duty as a potential juror to answer these questions. And I was surprised by how many people just in the jury pool had an experience like that. And then, and now as a author who writes about this subject, I mean, all the time. I think there's probably not a public event that I do where somebody doesn't come up and tell me their story. And I feel like it's an important and humbling role to be given that this precious thing that this person has carried and has revealed to very few people, and to be able to give some, I hope, some comfort and to be able to bring some meaning to that experience. And so that is a very kind of emotional part of the role, but the role of author, that, in the past as a prosecutor, people, like, they had no choice. The survivor just was assigned me as the prosecutor. They,
Yeah.
came to me, and I hope that I connected with them. I tried to be, building trust. It was all about building trust, and tried to be the person that they would feel comfortable giving that part of themselves to. But as an author, these are people who are just trusting me because they trust me, and it's a very meaningful part of the experience to connect on that level, and to hope that I'm bringing something that is useful to these survivors who are trusting me with that story, with their stories.
So you mentioned that writing the first novel was like the most difficult thing you've done. I'm sure I think the best way to ask this, but I'll just say, has it gotten easier? Have you found practices for yourself where, oh, there's different phases, or this is my routine, or I've learned this, or is it still just as difficult?
Yeah, that's interesting. It's not as hard as the first one. The first one, I just had no idea what I was doing. I wasn't sure I could do it. That's a pretty daunting hurdle.
Yeah.
Now I know I can do it. And I also do, like you said, the phases. There are definite phases, and in every single novel I've ever written, I've gotten to this point where I'm just like, that's it. I've reached the end. It's a good run, but I can't do this anymore. This sucks. I don't know how I managed to fool everybody the last couple times, but I can't do this, and my writing life is over. And in the beginning, each time I would get to that phase, I'd be like, well, that's it, well, goodbye. It was nice knowing you, writing world. And now at least I get to that point, and there's still this sense of despair, but there's also like a little angel on my shoulder saying, this is a phase, and you've done this 6 times before, and that each time you just plowed through this phase, and you're going to do it again. So that part is easier.
I love that. And I love that you've proved that to yourself by doing it again and again. That's such a powerful thing. So we've covered a lot with what you do and the power of it and the shift. Is there anything that I haven't asked about that you think sort of aligns to some of these themes, things that you think that my audience might want to know or talk about?
Well, you've asked so many great questions, Dan. I don't know. You're the questioner.
You never know what people say, though, with that at the end, though, too. Yeah, this is fascinating. I want to thank you for kind of digging into this. Your story is amazing on so many levels. And as we were just saying, I think the work is so important, too. It's neat to see how you've approached this from all different ways in your profession, and how you've, I don't know, just made such a big shift. And like you just said, this idea of doing it and proving that you're able to do this thing that is so difficult is just awesome. So thank you.
Thank you, Dan. Thanks for being interested and taking the time.
You can find Allison at AllisonLeotta.com. That is ALLISON LEOTTA. And of course, just type her name into Amazon to find her books. You can find me at wegrowmedia.com or on social media at Dan Blank. Thank you so much for listening to the end. Have a great day.